Hi there. A small presentation of a feature that I've been making in GameMaker. This is something that everybody who's building like a 2D or an isometric game wanted to try to incorporate in their game because it looks bloody amazing. Dynamic shadow system. Now, here's the thing. A dynamic shadow system it's a very it's a somewhat of a complex thing to make from scratch. That's why a lot of people make plugins and GMX extensions that you can import into your game project or import into GameMaker Studio and use it from there. But the problem is when you use extensions or especially DLLs, you're limiting yourself to the amount of platforms that you can export because iOS doesn't support DLLs. Like if you have a DLL extension or DLL plugin that does dynamic shadows, you're just tossing out iOS, Linux, Mac exports. All you're with is Windows and maybe I don't know if that's the case, maybe Windows Phone, depending on how that works. But this dynamic shadow system is built only using the built-in variables and functions that GameMaker provides. So I'm just gonna do a quick presentation as I explain how it works. So as you can see, I have just basic ground blocks. This is actually I've spent about 3-4 days on this, and this is the feature of the game that I'm working on. But I'm pretty sure you've heard that statement just numerous times. Right now, what this does, it's a fairly simple shadow system, and the best thing is that it does not use any external scripts or any external plugins. There are certain limitations that this particular system comes with. As you can see, if you have so far I've only tested it with fairly primitive like blocks, circles, fairly primitive shapes that are easy to trace. This system, the way it works is it checks the object that contains a shadow script, and it traces its edges, and then it basically traces the points outside of our flashlight sprite, which is this giant white circle that reveals everything behind the black surface. And we're using surfaces here. Thank God they made the surface system. So one thing to point out is that shaders and scripts and DLLs, the reason they're there is because they're made in such a way to take off a strain off of your CPU. That's basically how shaders work. Shaders are supposed to give you fine detail and effects without and they use GPU, your graphics, the power of your graphics card or graphics processor, instead of your CPU, which is your central processor. Now, this system uses the central processor. This is a CPU made shadow system. This is why it looks like a shadow system. It's simulated. It's not an actual ray tracing. I would technically call it ray tracing because of how I'm tracing how the light's supposed to go. But the tracing process is very simple. It's honestly just a number of loop statements, for statements, and while statement, or if statements and while loops that really trace the edges of objects, which is why it works well with primitive objects. But when you get complex, like if you have some sort of sprite of a let's see, I don't know, sprite of god damn, what's a complex object? I don't know, sprite of something complex, like something that has like crevices and bumps. I don't know, fuck it. Sprite of a camel. You know, you have a camel in your game, and you need to have a dynamic shadow on the camel. So, god damn it. your character's on the left and the camel's on the right. That kind of a shadow trace is far too complex for this shadow system to look interesting. So if you have something like a car, you can have a car that has an elliptic collision mask, and collision tracking is one of the features that allow the system to make the shadows. And if you put like your car into something like an ellipse shape, you will be able to get a dynamic shadow on that car. So that's one of the limitations. Second is the algorithm that traces these objects is fairly simple, but the computer has to perform it so many times. Every time this algorithm performs the check of ray tracing, or not ray tracing because it's not actual ray tracing. This particular algorithm performs the tracking of the light or tracking of the shadow every time the player moves. And you would imagine, I mean, as I said, this is a CPU-based process, so you'd imagine if you have a very complex room with like 50 to 100 objects, and every one of those objects needs a dynamic shadow. I mean, you would imagine how horribly how much information your CPU has to perform. Because shadows, as I said, tracing shadows is a job for your graphics card, for your graphics chip, your GPU. So, for example, we have this ground floor here, and we have a second floor here. We do not need shadow tracing. Like, for example, if there's nothing below this floor, we really don't need shadow tracing for every one of these blocks. Because what I can do is, since we're using surfaces and I'm subtracting the shadow from the surface, from the sprite of the flashlight, which is this giant circle around the main player object, you really need the objects that need to perform the shadow check. This corner here, this corner here for the second floor, as you can see if you step up or if you stand on the side, this is supposed to be shadow, and this corner here. So really, to get the shadow below, all you really need is to have an object below there that subtracts itself from the flashlight sprite on the surface. So all you just need to enable the shadows on these corner pieces. Like anywhere throughout the game, you really need to have no more than maybe 7 to 10 objects that require dynamic shadow, right? I mean, it's from one point perspective. I mean, not one. Sorry, I'm speaking concept art terms. From one point, on one hand, if you know, it's gonna be taking a lot of your power. On the other hand, too many dynamic shadows is honestly, it's just gonna look overwhelming, and you know, all good things and all the eye candy should be given in small doses, you know, just like regular candy, because you don't want to spoil their appetite. Anyways, I can make a tutorial on how to make this dynamic shadow system, and I'll basically, I'm not even gonna be typing in code. I'm gonna do it fairly quick. I'm gonna copy paste the code because I know it already works, and I'm gonna explain everything that son of a bitch, what each one of those lines of code does. I'm probably gonna do it at some point as I'm working on my game. On this game that you see in here, this is what the game is supposed to be. It's like a platformer game. So somewhere along the line, I'm gonna make a tutorial for the dynamic shadow system that only uses the internal functions of GameMaker, and just make sure to subscribe so that when I upload the video, you can actually see it. And I'm gonna post it on a number of forums just to see if people will be interested. Main thing to note is I've worked on this system up until the point that it worked enough to an acceptable point. There could be people who think, you know, well, you could add that, you could soften up your shadows, and I'm like, yes, I know that, but dynamic shadow system is not the primary purpose of this game. So what I got right now works for me. Alright, well, I hope you guys like this presentation, and, well, you know what to do. I'll see you in a second, because I'm going to be doing a presentation of what this video game is supposed to be. Alright!